everybody. It is Miss O'Connell. I hope you are all doing well. I am here to talk to you a little bit about chapter 19. So, this is actually going to be our last chapter that we're going to do. I apologize that I canceled your coming of age in Mississippi quiz. Your project will still be due next Monday. But like I said, I went to the hospital. I had really bad stomach pain and then I had to have surgery. So I'm on the mend. It's been almost a week, kind of getting back into the swing of things and slow moving. Everybody who has texted me or emailed me or Google Classroomed me that they hope I feel better, thank you very much. That means a lot to me. So, chapter 19 is all about politics and economics. Okay, so it's really interesting. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about in this chapter is really lining up with stuff that we will kind of see in today's politics. Okay, so we're talking about impeachment, which we just went through an impeachment, so we'll be able to kind of look at all of that stuff as well. So the first thing we're going to look at, lesson one, is the Nixon administration. So Richard Nixon in 1968, we already talked about Nixon as president during the Vietnam War. So we're going to talk about it a little bit differently today. So during 1968, Nixon is going to employ what he calls his Southern strategy. And the Southern strategy is his ability to kind of gain former Democratic territory by promising several things. So places in the South that had previously voted Democratically, they are now going to kind of switch to Nixon in 1968. So he was going to appoint only conservatives to federal courts. He promised to name a Southerner to the Supreme Court. He opposed court order busing, where you would integrate blacks and whites. So that appealed to Southerners because they were very against integration. And he promised to choose a vice presidential candidate that the South would support, not a Northerner, not a Westerner, someone that the South could get behind. And he does that. He actually chooses Spiro Agnew from Maryland, and he appeased a lot of people with that decision. So a lot of white Southerners wound up leaving the Democratic Party through slow desegregation. They worked to overturn civil rights policies, and a lot of them are going to be involved in reversing program that had cut off funds for racially segregated schools. Okay, so that Southern strategy is all about getting Nixon voters, or for getting Democrats to become Republicans and Nixon voters. So while Nixon is president, we're going to look at his domestic policies. So the first thing is law and order. So one of the first ideas he has is he said we have to go against these anti-Vietnam War protesters because we have to have a country that is behind our government and the decisions that we were making in Vietnam. So he's going to do that. We are going to have the Supreme Court here, where Earl Warren is going to retire as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he is going to replace Earl Warren with this man, Warren Burger, that was a Southerner, and he was pretty happy about that because he had promised that that was part of his Southern strategy. So he is also going to place 3 other Supreme Court justices on the bench during his time in office. So really, during his 6 years in office, he's going to have a lot of impact on the Supreme Court for sure. As far as other items with regards to his domestic policy, we have New Federalism. And New Federalism is this idea that Nixon wanted to reduce the size of the federal government. So he wanted to make it smaller. He thought that the federal government held too much power. And he's quoted as saying, "I reject the patronizing idea that government in Washington, D.C. is wiser, more honest, and more efficient than government at the local or state level." So he believed that local and state government should have more power to ease kind of the burden of the federal government. He also passed some revenue sharing bills, which would grant federal funds to state and local agencies as long as they would meet certain conditions. Okay, so they had to follow what the federal government wanted, but it gave the states and local government a little bit more power. But if they didn't follow what the federal government wanted, those funds would be cut off. So it's a little bit of a catch-22. And then dismantling the Great Society. So Lyndon Johnson had done a lot as far as working for the middle and lower class. So the first thing that Nixon does was he vetoes the funding for the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is going to take away housing for low-income families. He's going to eliminate the Office of Economic Opportunity, and he's going to try to shut down Job Corps, but he winds up being very unsuccessful in his endeavors. So Congress sees what Nixon is doing, and they are going to wind up appropriating money for programs that Nixon opposed because they didn't like that he was really only speaking to those wealthy Southern, or wealthy Americans and then Southern Americans to get those votes. So they are going to take money, and they have that power to give it to programs that Nixon didn't necessarily support. Nixon refused to release the funds. This is known as impoundment. And by 1973, Nixon had impounded $18 billion because he was upset that Congress was going against what his wishes were. The Supreme Court wound up declaring impoundment unconstitutional. So it ultimately does not work out for Nixon. We also have Nixon's domestic policy. Other domestic policies, the Family Assistance Plan. And this is definitely not one of his greatest ideas. This was Nixon's reform of the welfare system. Okay, welfare, giving money to those families that need it either through food or funding or school or what have you. Nixon says, okay, this is what we're going to do. We are going to provide needy families with around $1,600 a year. Okay, they will earn extra earnings through a job. If they don't get a job, they won't earn anything else. Okay, but yearly they will get a grant that they don't have to pay back of $1,600. Well, as you can imagine, this didn't really get great reviews. Conservatives didn't like it because it guaranteed a handout, even if it was only $1,600. Liberals liked it because it took steps toward feeding an aid to the poor, but they didn't like the fact that it was so little. Okay, so they really wanted to kind of improve on that amount as well. And it wound up being defeated in the Senate anyway, so it's something that does not pass. All right, as far as Nixon's foreign policy goes, Nixon is going to promote what is known as détente. If you remember, the Cold War is still going on at this time. So détente is this policy that attempts to relax or ease tensions between nations. And specifically at this time, it was to ease tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. So here's a quote from him. "We must understand that détente is not a love fest. It is an understanding between nations that have opposite purposes, but which share common interests, including the avoidance of a nuclear war. Only as long as the potential aggressor is made to recognize that neither aggression nor war will be profitable." So basically Nixon said we need to put aside our differences. We need to understand that we might have to work together, and we're going to share common interests. We can't always threaten nuclear war if we don't get what we want. And the Soviet Union at this time isn't really necessarily happy because Nixon was very anti-communist when he came into the presidency. And they're going to believe in détente, but they wanted to negotiate with Nixon. And Nixon as well wanted to negotiate with other communist nations in hopes of achieving international goals. So I think that the Soviet Union was a little bit eased at that interest. And here's a picture of Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev each holding, nuclear weapons behind their backs. So it's kind of interesting. So Nixon is going to put actions to his words, okay? So he wants to work with these other nations. So he's going to go to China. China is a communist nation at this time. And the U.S. had not recognized China since it became communist in 1949. So this was really a big step for the United States. And, Nixon meets Mao Zedong. He meets the Emperor of China, who he's dining with here. And he visits in February of 1972, and they make a lot of compromises, okay? Both leaders of the United States and China at this time agree to establish what they consider to be more normal relations between their countries. So really watch this video. It's kind of funny because it shows Nixon how out of his element he is. It also shows Nixon to be quite the egotist and wanting to get off the plane by himself first so that he got all the attention. So it's really interesting to kind of see. Okay, so he goes to China to mend fences. Next, he is going to go to Moscow, which is in the Soviet Union. And this is the first American president since World War II to visit the Soviet Union because of all the Cold War tensions. And they are going to have a week-long summit. That's Brezhnev and Nixon. And that's proposed by the Soviet Union. And what they accomplish during this week-long summit is they sign the SALT I treaty, which is the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. And this temporarily froze the number of strategic nuclear weapons that were being created. And they wanted to increase trade and the exchange of scientific information so everyone could kind of be on the same page. While, yes, that's great in theory, I don't necessarily know if that is, if they were as open as they said they were going to be, for sure. But Nixon is making strides forward. So then we have the Helsinki Accords. This is where the US, Canada, and most of Eastern and Western Europe meet in Finland. They committed to 3 sets of recommendations that focused on security, economic, and human rights issues. And here's a quote from that. Respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of thought, conscience, religion, or belief for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And that was decided at the Helsinki Accord. So it was really about human rights and treating people as humans and individuals. And that was something that, you know, the United States, Canada, and most of Europe could agree on. Okay, so that is the end of section 1. It's about Nixon's foreign and domestic policy. So you kind of get to see him as president outside of the Vietnam War, which is the only other thing we had kind of talked about. So it was a short lecture today. Tomorrow we'll talk about Watergate, which I think you will find really exciting. I am looking to have a quiz on this chapter. That will be your last assignment other than your coming of age in Mississippi. As you know, we don't have exams or anything like that. So I hope everybody is doing well. I'm really sad that we haven't gotten to kind of meet together and things like that anymore. I really loved having you guys in class, and hopefully I see a lot of you next year. So hang in there. You know, hopefully we'll get back to some sense of normalcy coming up. But if we don't, you know, we're going to have to adjust. So hang in there. I miss you all. Bye.